Greetings and welcome to another installment from the Patchwork Productionz Learn to Crochet for Beginners series. In this video, you will learn how to make a pot mat and you'll learn about the slip stitch. For those of you who are new to my channel, my name is Stitch, and Patchwork Productionz is all about learning and doing crochet. So make sure you subscribe so you never miss another installment. Without further ado, let's get started. So for this video, I'll be using not my normal yarn, but some cotton yarn. It's still a weight 4 or medium worsted weight yarn. And I will also be using a US 10 or J10 5.75 millimeter crochet hook. Now for this tutorial, we're doing something a little different. We're actually going to learn how to make something. We're going to make a pot mat, and we're also going to learn a new stitch, although some people refer to it as a technique, which is the slip stitch. If you've seen the previous tutorial videos, which if you have not, I encourage you to check those out. I'll put a link in the description box down below. But if you've seen these videos, we have learned the 4 elementary stitches, you could say, for crochet. We learned about the single crochet, the half double crochet, the double crochet, and the treble crochet. These are the stitches that are primarily used in crochet, period, and they are the components that make up all the other various stitches that can be used within crochet. Some of these are used more than others. So the treble crochet is not used nearly as frequently as, say, the single crochet. But they all have their different purposes. So today, for making our pot mat, we're actually going to work just with the single crochet. And throughout these videos, we have basically been starting the process for making any pot mat, because it really is not hard to make one. You basically just work a stitch in the row. Now, I'm not particularly certain if anyone has ever made or tried to make a pot mat with treble crochet. If you know someone who did, or if you did yourself, let me know in the comments. But typically, from what I've seen, you use a tighter stitch for a pot mat, and so something more like a single crochet, even the double crochet kind of passes for it, would be used for a pot mat. So for this project, we're just going to stick with the single crochet, and we're going to use cotton yarn for this, because cotton yarn is what's referred to as a natural yarn in terms of its material, and so this can actually hold up to heat. Now, I have seen acrylic pot mats made with acrylic yarn, and they apparently have held up pretty well. But generally, if you're going to make a pot mat or anything that's going to be close to high heat, it would be a good idea to use a material like cotton, because it can take that heat without much of a problem to the yarn. If you want to learn more about yarn materials and how they can be used, I encourage you to check out my tutorial video on that as well. But for now, let's just begin. It's very simple. If you've seen the video on how to make the single crochet, you know that we have to start with a slip knot and a foundation chain. Our foundation chain will be a foundation chain of 23 chains. This is because we're going to be working 22 single crochets, and so that extra chain is going to be our turning chain, so that we can work into the next row. Now, as far as cotton yarn goes for working with it, it basically works like any other kind of yarn. It does have a few differences. It's not as springy as, per se, acrylic yarn. Acrylic yarn has a lot of stretch, it's kind of fluffy, springy, and that does depend on the make of yarn, the brand that you get, but as far as cotton yarn goes, it is less springy. It's a little bit more, you could say, stiff or sturdy, but the same principles apply to it. You want to make sure you crochet loosely, in fact, especially since it's stiffer, because it will be harder to work into a stiff stitch if it's tight. So crocheting loosely makes it all easier. Now let's count this to make sure we have the right amount. We still can identify these stitches by the V's at the top. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. All right. 22, 23. Okay, so we have our 23 chains for our foundation chain, and we can begin crocheting. We have the 23rd chain, or the first chain from the hook. This is our turning chain, so we're going to work into the second chain from the hook, and we're going to work into it from the bottom, so we're going to work into the bump, and we're going to begin our single crochets. And we're just going to crochet across the entire row of the foundation chain. And basically, to make this pot mat, it's very simple. All you have to do is work as many rows as will make this approximately a square. So I'm not certain exactly, precisely how many rows it will take to make a square out of this, but probably, generally, for me, it's about a few more rows as you did foundation chain stitches. So I've done a foundation chain of 23 chains, and so I can expect to do at minimum 23 rows. I could do more, I don't know if I will, but that should get it to a close enough shape to a square, maybe a slight rectangle, and that's pretty much all you do. Now we will do something a little extra, because you're going to learn about the slip stitch, but for if you just wanted to make something really quick, a quick pot mat that just served its purpose, this is basically all you have to do. And so let me just finish this row, and we can do, oops, yeah, so we can do a quick review on how to move from row to row, and then I'll go ahead and finish the rest of the rows. So let me just finish these last 3 single crochets here. Remember that to move through rows when working in the row and crochet, you always have to add a turning chain. For the single crochet, that's always 1 chain. And so to move on, we're going to chain 1, turn our work, so that we are now working on the other side, and we're going to insert our hook through the hole where it's under the 2 V's. So not this hole, we're going to insert our hook into this hole right here under the 2 V's. Make sure you're not inserting your hook into the turning chain, but you're inserting it into the stitch, the single crochet from row 1, and there we begin row 2. Now, if you're trying to keep track of your rows, because you want to make sure you know how many rows you have, you don't have to. The amount of rows you put is approximate, just until it looks like a square. But if you want to keep track of your rows, I can give you a little tip that I use personally. Let me just cut some yarn here real quick. Oh, I have a piece. So this is something that I do. There are stitch markers, row markers that you can use, and I might do a later video on this for different ways to keep track of your rows. But a simple way that I use, because you can use like a safety pin if you have a safety pin, all you need to do is insert that safety pin into the last stitch that you did and keep going like that to keep track. Something that I do though is just take a piece of yarn that's contrasting in color, and let's just undo this for a second so we have our turning chain left. So I finished row 1, right? And all you have to do is put that yarn in there, and oops, I pulled out my turning chain. Put that back. So you just insert that into there, and then when you start going into row 2, all you need to do now is pull that yarn right through. And the reason I like doing this is because then you know that every time you see one of these bumps, you can just count 2 rows, because you know that that's row 1 and row 2. So when you were to finish this and turn it and come back and do row 3, then you would just put this yarn into row 3. So every time you see a bump, you can count 2, and if you see it where there's no bump, it's just hanging out, you know that that's 1. So it's a simple way to count your rows. Another way is these holes that you see here, that's where you worked into a stitch. You could count that hole as 1. So if I were to work into this stitch now, a hole would be there when I go to work row 3, so I count 1, 2, and then I know that that was 2, and then the 3 I just worked it, so I know that that's it. So there are a couple ways that you can keep track of how many rows you work into, but it's not completely necessary if you're making just a simple pot mat, unless you're following a pattern, of course. But if you're just working a simple pot mat by yourself, you just do as many stitches across for whatever size you want, and then you work as many rows as you desire till it looks like a small rectangle, a square, whatever shape you're going for. Also, before I show you the almost finished product, as you're working your rows, you may notice that your project starts to twist in all sorts of interesting ways. Fear not, that is completely normal. I guess you could say by all the twisting from the turning chains and, you know, the yarn that you work with, it kind of adds a little twist to your project, and that's perfectly normal. As it grows bigger in size, it will sort of straighten itself out, but it's a pot mat. Nothing a hot pot bottom can't fix. So I will finish this, and then we can see how to work the rest of the pot mat. Alright, so I just had a second ball of yarn with the whole project prepared. So basically, I ended up working 23 rows up, and so this is sort of what it would look like. It's not completely a square. This side is just ever so slightly shorter. The height is slightly shorter, and as you can see, my project still has its twist in it. That twist was as I was making the project. It's not as bad, but as I said, this is completely normal, nothing to be afraid of. If you see it happening with your project, it's kind of just like that. There are ways to straighten it, that'll be covered in a later video, but also, this is a pot mat. Rest a pot on here once, and you'll be fine. And also, just as a quick note, remember I mentioned that you can count your rows by the holes that you see in here. If you go to the bottom of the work, and you see this first hole right here, that's the hole made from the stitch of row 2 being worked there. This is the foundation chain, so that's the hole from the stitch of row 1 being worked into the foundation chain. So this could be counted as 1. This is the hole from row 3 being counted into row 2. And so basically, you can just count these holes one by one as a way, not the most efficient way, there are better ways of doing this, but it is a way to count how many rows you've worked for your project. So basically, if you wanted to end here, you could cut your rope, fasten off, and you could be done. But I'm going to show you something to make this look a little nicer and give you the opportunity of learning another fundamental stitch, or some people consider a technique, and this is the slip stitch. Now, for this tutorial, slip stitch is referring to the US terminology. I believe the British terminology for the slip stitch would actually be the single crochet. But the slip stitch is basically a stitch that's used to move across the row, you could say, without adding any height. Remember from the previous tutorial video, basically I showed you a little stitch map. I crocheted the various levels of the stitches. You had the single crochet, the half double crochet, the treble crochet, and you can see their heights, the height of each stitch, all grows with each of them. So this is one height, and this is just a little taller, this is just a little taller, and then this is taller, and there's taller stitches, but they kind of went up in height. Well, the slip stitch is the stitch below the single crochet, and it's said to work for not adding height, because let me just show you a quick diagram here. I'm going to chain one and do this for you. So basically, the slip stitch is worked as such. You insert your hook, you yarn over, so it's almost like a single crochet, because for a single crochet you would then yarn over and draw through both. But instead, you take that yarn over and you simply pull it through. So I'm going to do it again for you, nice and close so you can see. Insert your hook, yarn over, and then take that same yarn over and draw it through this loop. Now, you can sort of see it here already, but there's not like a height to the stitch that you can see here. It's just kind of lining the top. Of course, it's a stitch, so in a way it's still adding a level of height, but it's not enough. You don't commonly see, at least I haven't commonly seen, anyone make something like a pot mat per se with entirely slip stitches. I'm sure it's possible, and it'd actually be pretty interesting to try. But the slip stitch is not generally used as a stitch to make something, which is why some people consider it more of a technique than a stitch. The slip stitch is used for many things. One of them is moving across the row without adding any height, and you can use this, which is what we're going to use it for today, as like a small border around the square. Another way that a slip stitch is used is to join. Now, we'll have some later videos covering various ways to join, but let's say you run out of yarn and you need to attach maybe the same color yarn, but to your project, you can use a slip stitch. If you're changing colors mid-project, you can use a slip stitch to join to your work to continue. Let's say we're working in the round and we need to begin our project. You would use a slip stitch to join whatever small set of chains you make. As I said, we'll have videos on this later, but basically the slip stitch is used in many of those different areas commonly, and it's pretty versatile, pretty wonderful, but there are some key things to remember with the slip stitch. Let me do this again for your demonstration. So, the slip stitch is a little different. You see how all these stitches kind of have a stretch to them. They're together, but they can still move, even the tops. And even for cotton being a stiffer yarn, it has some give. You see, the slip stitch, when you make a slip stitch, it is critically important to have good yarn tension and make a very loose stitch, because I'm going to make this tight intentionally. And you're going to see that if, for whatever reason, if depending on my project or whatever, if I had to work back into this stitch, believe me, I've struggled. It's a pain to have to go back into this extremely tight stitch. It is super critical that when you work a slip stitch, this slip stitch is nice and loose and free. Nice and big, because when you go, if for whatever reason you have to work back into that stitch for whatever project you're doing, you have to go in a tight stitch, it's going to be hard. If it's loose, you can work into it and you won't have much trouble. Another good reason to work loose stitches is that whatever size you make the stitch, it's just as the same with the top. Whatever size you make this stitch, that's the size it's going to be. And if you make it too tight, you can see your project kind of warp a little. It'll shrink just ever so slightly in size, and all of it adds up. It's the same with the slip stitch. Just like this has spring here, once we add the slip stitch around the side, it will kind of form that shape. It's not going to be able to stretch as much, and I'll show a demonstration after we put the full border around. It's not going to be able to stretch as much because that stitch is kind of holding its shape. If you make that tight, it kind of has a natural give. And if you make that tight, it's not going to be able to spring back to its original size. It's going to be stuck in a smaller size. So you'll either have to make a lot of stitches of the slip stitch, or your project is going to start to shrink. So it's very critical that when you're making the slip stitch around your project, or for whatever project you do, unless the project otherwise directs, make sure that it's nice and loose and kind of follows the same size as it naturally has, so that your project can keep its original shape and it can still have a little bit of give, of course, depending on the project. For now, though, we're just going to keep it nice and simple because you don't have to do that much to make this effective for what we're doing. On the tops, it's pretty easy. You just work into the stitches like you normally would. On the sides, it's a little different because you could consider it a little guesswork. You've got to find where to do it. You kind of just go into any hole. What I'm going to do is I'm simply going to work along this side now, because you see my stitches are kind of going in this direction, so I'm just going to curve it down, and I feel it just makes it look better. And I'll basically work I'll basically work a slip stitch into each one of these holes, potentially I'll probably keep it towards the top. So there's a hole here, but then there's like a little bump loop here, and then there's a hole here, and then I'll probably just work into those. Do whatever looks best to you. It's kind of guesswork for the sides, but just make sure, as always, that the stitches are loose. So I'm gonna work one here. Let's see. This should work. And yeah, I think I like that. And let's see what happens when I work into this next one. Yeah, I think I like that. So I'm just gonna work across these little, so there's a little bump here, or I should say the two loops where there's a hole, and I'm gonna work into that, and then there is, ooh, that's a little tight. There we go. And then there is, it seems like there's a bump here, and I'm gonna work that. So I'm just gonna work down this, maybe speed up the video a little bit, but I'm just gonna work down this and catch up with you when I get to the bottom. Okay, so this is this side finish, and it looks a little interesting because the way I did it, I ended up just working into, let me show you on this side, these little holes that you see here. And as you can see, which is kind of the element of the slip stitch, it kind of just rides on the top of the pot mat. It's not really on the side. It's not much on the edge. It's more like on the face of it. And so I'm gonna show you just a few stitches on the bottom here, which has worked pretty normally. And then I'm going to do it a little differently on this side so you can see the difference of, how they can be worked and what the effects look like. So for this side, you kind of have to get around this corner here. Because it's the slip stitch, you don't need to add any turning chains or do anything extra, so you can just work straight into, so like, you're right here. Of course, I finished in this hole right here. But you're right here, and there's this stitch, like a legit stitch, and you basically just work right there. And you kind of just immediately go right up. And so I can do the next one. And right there, I've already rounded this corner, which is pretty good. And even now, as I'm working into these, actual stitches, the slip stitch is like trying to stay along the side of the project instead of more on the edge. Of course, if you look at the back though, you can kind of see what it looks like. I'm not sure if you can see that well on camera, but it kind of is almost like making a ledge. And this is kind of how the slip stitch works. Remember, it's basically not adding any height to the project. So instead of going up, it's kind of going to the side and writing. Of course, if I were to now start doing single crochets back into that, it would have a little ridge at the back, a little edge, and it kind of start going back up again. So yeah, that's kind of just how the slip stitch is. Don't worry if you might think it's something that's weird with you, but it's perfectly fine. And just remember, for a slip stitch, all you have to do is draw that loop through both the loop you insert it into and through the stitch. So you just insert and then draw the loop. No need to yarn over any more times. Just yarn over once and through. So I'll just keep doing these and then catch up on the other side. Okay, so now I'm on the other side, if you would. So we kind of started with this one, we did the bottom here, and now we're on this side. And for this side, I'm going to do it a little differently than I did on this side, and I'm going to more consistently stay, oops, got my hand all tangled. I'm going to more consistently stay in some of these loops at the top. And we're going to see how much different that looks as opposed to what I did here, which was staying more in the holes that you can see here. So I'm going to do that again to go around this corner. You don't need to do any yarn overs or anything. You just go there, no turning chains, and boom. Right like that, we've already started going around that corner. Very simple. So I'm going to finish this, and I'm actually just going to finish the top as well. I'll leave 3 stitches so I can show you one last thing, and so yeah, I'll catch up with you there. Alright, so I went through all of these. I have left a few stitches here so I can show you one last thing, and I worked this side. As you can see, hold on, as you can see, it looks a lot different from this side. Just by the nature of the way I did it, because this is working on the top, the little edges can still be seen here. But on this side that I just worked, I worked in those edges, and so the edge looks much nicer. So I would recommend doing it this way, just so that you know what I did. I basically worked into the bumps, and then also this little, guess you could say, 2 V's between the bumps. I just picked the back loop and worked into that as well, just one of them, and it made a much better look on this side than on the other side. Now, just as a tip, if you notice that your project is starting to warp or shrink just a little, that just means that you either have too tight of slip stitches, or you're putting too few slip stitches on a certain side. And so all you have to do is just put an extra slip stitch on that side that you're doing per however many stitches you had before, and you should be fine. And as I mentioned, the stretch, it's a little bit confined, but not as bad, because we pretty much kept our stitches loose and kept our stitches a along the same length that it originally was. So it can spring and it's there. But if you notice, it is a little different from the middle. The middle has more give than the edges just by nature of the stitch. So the last thing we'll do is just to make our pot mat look cute. I'm going to finish the last few slip stitches here, and then right at this one, we're going to chain 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, oops. Let me just pull that out. 9, 10, 11, 12. And then we're going to go to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. I'll go to this. And basically, we're going to join with a slip stitch. This is where the slip stitch really shines. And then I'm actually going to do one more to fasten off. So slip stitch right there, pull a little tight. And this has just made a little loop for our pot mat to add an extra level of functionality and looks to it. So we can now fasten this off. And there we have it. Behold, a finished pot mat. This can be made within the space of about, an hour, maybe 2, but it can definitely be made within a day. Something quick, something simple, something easy. It can be made with just single crochets, nothing fancy, and now you know how to make a slip stitch border and a little chain loop for hanging purposes. So there you have it. That will be all for this tutorial. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this tutorial and want to learn more about crochet, be sure to hit the subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss another video. Don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up and also share this video with your friends and family or on social media. And feel free to leave a comment down below. If you have any questions or suggestions or any feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Until next time, catch you later.